She came to clean his floors. He came to end his life. Neither expected what happened next. Kim Ha-jin stood at the edge of his penthouse balcony in Seoul, 70 stories above the city he once owned, the wind cutting through his expensive robe like judgment. Behind him, the door swung open. Cynthia froze in the doorway, mop in hand, heart slamming against her ribs. Their eyes met across the darkness. Something ancient and terrifying stirred between them, and the world held its breath. Welcome to Black and Soul TV. Please like, share, and subscribe. Kim Ha-jin had been a god once. Not the kind people prayed to. The kind they feared. The kind that made men cross the street when they saw his car approaching. At 60, he had commanded the most powerful criminal syndicate in South Korea for 3 decades, the Black Phoenix, an organization that had its fingerprints on half the ports in Asia, on government contracts, on whispered decisions made in rooms most people didn't know existed. He had owned buildings, politicians, judges. He had been untouchable. Past tense. The fall had been spectacular, as falls from that height always are. A betrayal from inside his own inner circle, a rival syndicate that had waited 20 years for the perfect moment, a tax investigation triggered by an anonymous tip that led prosecutors directly to accounts he thought were buried deep enough to survive an earthquake. Within 18 months, everything unraveled. The organization disbanded. His assets were seized. His only son, Juno, cut ties publicly and moved to Canada, citing shame. His wife of 32 years filed for divorce through her attorney and never looked him in the face again. By the time Cynthia Williams arrived at the service entrance of the Gangnam residential tower carrying her cleaning supplies and her second job application, Kim Ha-jin was a man with very little left to lose. He also had 6 months to live. The diagnosis had come quietly, the way devastating things often do. Liver cancer, late stage, discovered almost accidentally during a routine check by the only doctor still willing to see him. The physician had used words like aggressive and limited in options, but Ha-jin had stopped listening after the word terminal. He had walked out of the clinic into cold Seoul air and stood on the pavement for a long time before getting into the single car he still owned and driving back to the 1-bedroom apartment his lawyer had negotiated to keep out of the asset seizure. It was not the apartment of a man who had once owned 3 floors of a building in Apgujeong. It had thin walls and a view of another building and a kitchen that smelled faintly of the previous tenant. Ha-jin had stood in the middle of it and felt something he hadn't felt in 50 years of ruthlessness. Ashamed. The cleaning service was an arrangement made by his building manager, a squat man named Mr. Pyo, who still treated Ha-jin with careful deference, though no one had asked him to anymore. The service sent someone twice a week. Ha-jin had not asked for the detail. He had not asked for much of anything lately. The day Cynthia first appeared at his door, he was sitting at the kitchen table in a robe, staring at a glass of water, wondering how many of his remaining days he intended to spend exactly this way. She knocked twice. When he didn't answer, she knocked again with the particular firm patience of someone who had spent years doing work that people pretended not to notice. He opened the door. She was tall, curvy in a way that took up space unapologetically, with deep brown skin and wide dark eyes that assessed the apartment behind him before they settled on his face. She had a cleaning caddy in one hand and a quiet kind of dignity that immediately irritated him. He was not accustomed to people who weren't afraid of him. "I'm from Clean Pro Services," she said in careful Korean, accented but grammatically intact. "I'm here for the scheduled cleaning." He looked at her the way men like him look at things they have decided to dislike before they've examined them. "You're American," he said. Not a question. A category. "Yes," she replied simply, neither apologizing for it nor offering it as an invitation. He stepped aside without another word and went back to his kitchen table and his glass of water. Cynthia Williams had been in Seoul for 8 months. She had come for reasons that made perfect sense at the time and considerably less sense now, though she had not allowed herself the luxury of regretting them. Her younger brother Marcus was in a specialty hospital in Incheon receiving treatment for a rare bone condition that their mother's insurance had stopped covering. Cynthia had a communications degree she wasn't using, a former marketing job that had gone remote and then gone away entirely, and a practical understanding that rent in Seoul was cheaper than rent in Atlanta and that the cleaning industry paid cash weekly. She had taken 3 jobs. The Clean Pro contract was her Tuesday through Thursday rotation. Ha-jin's apartment was her last stop both days. She learned quickly that the last stop was the hardest one. Not because of the cleaning itself. The apartment was not especially dirty. A man living alone who barely cooked and rarely moved generated minimal mess. The difficulty was the atmosphere, which sat heavy and hostile in every room like something had decided to take up permanent residence there. Hajin rarely acknowledged her presence. When he did, it was rarely pleasant. "You moved the chair," he said flatly the second week, pointing at the dining chair she had shifted to vacuum beneath it and returned to its exact original position. "I put it back exactly where it was," Cynthia said. "It was facing the window before." She looked at the chair. She looked at the window. She moved the chair 3 centimeters to the left. "Better." He looked at it for a long moment. "You're slow." She picked up her vacuum. "I'm thorough," she said, and continued working. He said nothing else that day, but she caught him watching her once from the kitchen doorway, his arms crossed over his chest, his expression unreadable and oddly concentrated, as though she were a problem he hadn't decided how to solve yet. A few days later, she arrived to find a broken glass on the kitchen floor and Hajin sitting at the table with a small bleeding cut on his palm, making no move to address either situation. "Were you going to clean that up?" she asked. "That's what I'm paying for," he said. She set down her caddy, pulled out a first aid kit she kept for exactly the kind of clients who didn't take care of themselves, and approached the table. He looked at the kit with something approaching offense. "I don't need that. You're bleeding on your table," she said, "which is also what I'm getting paid to clean, so let me look at your hand." He had been accustomed to being alone, lost feelings of care or love, and all he could wait for was his time to die. But will Cynthia the maid change his heart? Will she show him that life is worth living for despite all odds? Hit that subscribe button and let's dive in. He stared at her. No one talked to him this way. No one had talked to him this way in decades. The people in his previous life had approached him with their eyes slightly lowered and their sentences carefully constructed to contain nothing that might offend. Cynthia Williams was looking directly at him with the calm authority of someone who had decided that being intimidated by a grumpy old man in a bathrobe was simply not an efficient use of her energy. Despite everything, he put his hand on the table. She cleaned the cut efficiently, applied a bandage, and then went to clean up the broken glass. She didn't say anything else. Neither did he. But when she was leaving, he glanced at the bandage on his palm, and something in his expression shifted almost imperceptibly, like a crack in old stone, there for a fraction of a second and then gone. The following week, she arrived to find him in a state she hadn't seen before. He was dressed, which was unusual, but sitting in the dark living room at 11 in the morning with the curtains drawn, and the stillness around him was different from his usual hostile silence. It was heavier, more exhausted. She turned on the light without asking. He didn't protest. She cleaned around him carefully, and at some point she opened the curtains to let in the gray soul light, and he looked out the window for a long time without speaking. "You don't have to do that," he said eventually. "The curtains. All of this." He gestured vaguely at the room, at the cleaning supplies, at her presence. "This entire arrangement. I'm contracted through the end of the month," she said. "So I do, actually." He almost smiled. She wasn't certain, because it happened too quickly and his mouth wasn't practiced at it anymore. But she thought the corner of his lip moved. "Where in America are you from?" he asked, which was the first personal question he had directed at her since she'd started coming. "Atlanta," she said. "Georgia." He nodded slowly. "I had business associates in New York. Once." "Once?" she repeated, not as a question. "Yes," he said. "Once." She didn't press. She finished cleaning and let herself out, and that evening on the subway back to her apartment, she thought about the word once, and how it sat inside him like a stone, and how a man like that, powerful and solitary and slowly being dismantled by something she couldn't name, was the kind of person you had to be careful around, not because of who he had been, but because of the particular gravity of someone standing at the edge of something with nothing left to hold them back. She should have put more distance between herself and that observation. She didn't. The next Tuesday, she brought 2 cups of coffee from the cafe at the bottom of the building. She put one on the kitchen table in front of him without comment. He looked at it. He looked at her. She began cleaning the bathroom. When she came back, the cup was empty. This became, somehow, a ritual. Small, unspoken, improbable. She brought coffee. He drank it. Neither of them acknowledged it as anything other than a practical arrangement. But she began to notice small changes. The curtains were already open on Thursdays when she arrived. As though he had remembered, she preferred the light. Once she found the broken handle of her cleaning caddy repaired, sealed with a strip of strong tape in the kitchen junk drawer. She had mentioned offhand 3 weeks ago that the hinge was cracking. He said nothing about it when she noticed. Neither did she. but his silence had begun to shift in texture. Less like dismissal, more like restraint. Then came the evening that changed the arc of everything. She had run behind schedule that Thursday because of a missed subway connection, and by the time she reached his apartment, it was past 7. She knocked. No answer. She used the building pass Mr. Pio had given her for exactly this kind of situation, let herself in, and found the apartment empty, the lights off, the front windows wide open despite the cold. Then she heard it. The sound of the balcony door, already open, and footsteps on the narrow concrete strip outside. She stepped into the living room and saw him standing at the railing. He was not looking at the view. He was looking down. His hands gripped the cold metal, not for support, but with the particular intention of someone who had made a decision and was giving themselves one last moment to confirm it. Cynthia's heart stopped. Then it slammed back to life. "Hajin," she said. "Not sir. Not Mr. Kim. Just his name, spoken with the kind of quiet force that cuts through everything else." He turned. He looked at her with the stunned expression of someone who had been somewhere else entirely and been suddenly pulled back. "What are you doing here?" he said. His voice was controlled, but something in it cracked at the edges. "I'm late," she said. She kept walking toward him, slowly, the way you approach something you're terrified to startle. "The subway. I should have been here at 5. She reached the balcony doorway. The Seoul night spread out behind him, millions of lights against darkness, indifferent and beautiful. "Go inside," he said. "You don't need to see this." "See what?" she asked, and she stepped through the door and stood beside him at the railing and looked out at the city the same way he had been looking at it, and said nothing else for a long moment. "I have 6 months," he said finally. He hadn't told anyone. She was the first person he had said it to out loud, and the words came out stripped of everything. No performance, no armor, just the fact itself. "I know," she said. She had noticed the medication bottles in the bathroom cabinet. She had noticed the hospital receipts on the counter. She had put it together weeks ago and said nothing. He turned to look at her. "You knew," he said. "I suspected," she said. "Hajin." She said his name again, deliberately, anchoring him. "Whatever you were about to do. Don't. You don't know what you're asking," he said. "I'm asking you not to die on a Thursday," she said. "Because I'm already late, and I really can't afford to deal with the paperwork." It was absurd. It was so absurd that it broke something open in him, and for the first time in a very long time, Kim Hajin laughed. Not the polished, controlled sound he had once used in boardrooms. Something real, surprised out of him, rough at the edges and completely unguarded. She kept her face composed, but her hands were shaking. "Come inside," she said. "I'll make tea." He followed her inside. She made tea. He sat at the kitchen table, and she sat across from him, and for an hour and a half she listened while he talked. Not about the organization, not about the empire he had built, but about his son Juno at age 7 running to him across an airport arrivals hall. About the first business he had ever owned, a small shipping office in Busan, before everything went dark and complicated. About what it felt like to stand in a hospital corridor and understand that the number of days remaining to you was specific and finite and not especially long. She told him about Marcus, about the bone treatments and the cost of the specialist and the particular math she did every week to figure out what was possible and what wasn't. "You're doing all of this for your brother," Hajin said. "He'd do it for me," she said. He looked at her across the kitchen table in his apartment with the thin walls and the neighbors' cooking smells and the view of another building, and she could see him recalibrating something, filing something under a different category. "You're not what I expected," he said. "What did you expect?" He paused. "Someone easier to dismiss," he admitted, and she could see what it cost him to say it. A man who had spent 60 years maintaining the impression that he had no capacity for regret. "You can try harder," she offered. "I don't think I can," he said. She could have let him die. She could have not noticed. If she hadn't been there, he would be no more. He lost all hope, all happiness, and wanted to end it all. But she refused and convinced him other. Was it for love or pity? Hit that subscribe button. Let's hear your answer in the comments. She went home that night and stood in her small apartment bathroom for a long time staring at the mirror and telling herself, with increasingly limited conviction, that this was still just a job. The next day, she was not scheduled to work. She showed up anyway with a box of groceries, because she had noticed his refrigerator contained mostly condiments and a suspiciously old container of leftovers, and because she had spent the night half awake thinking about what he might do with an unoccupied day and no one to interrupt him. He opened the door and looked at the groceries. "This isn't your scheduled day." "I know," she said. "Let me in." He stepped aside. She cooked a real meal for the first time in that apartment, rice and soup and a side dish, following a simple recipe she'd learned from a Korean coworker at Clean Pro. She wasn't perfect at it. He corrected her twice, coming to stand beside her at the stove with the unself-conscious authority of someone who apparently did know how to cook properly and had simply stopped doing so. They ate together in the kitchen. He said nothing about how unexpected this was, which was itself a kind of acknowledgement. "Why are you here?" he asked, midway through the meal. "Because I needed to make sure you were still here," she said directly. He put down his spoon, looked at her. There was something in his eyes she hadn't seen before, something layered, complex, not quite recognized yet by either of them. "That's a complicated thing to need," he said. "Yes," she agreed. Over the following weeks, something that neither of them had names for began to grow in the spaces between what was said and what wasn't. She still came twice weekly for the cleaning, but she also came on unscheduled days with groceries or just to sit and argue with him about the documentary he'd been watching on the small television, or to make him come with her to the rooftop garden on the building's 6th floor for air, because his doctor had said movement was important and he was spectacularly resistant to being told what to do until Cynthia told him, at which point he did it with the practiced irritation of a man who was complying under protest and did not intend for that compliance to be confused with agreement. He was still difficult. He made sharp comments about her accent when she spoke Korean, correcting her pronunciation with the prickly energy of a man whose control over something was very limited and who therefore exercised maximum precision in whatever small domains remained available to him. He complained about her taste in music, which she played on her phone while cleaning, and about the fact that she reorganized his kitchen cabinets in a way that was objectively more logical and that he pretended was deeply inconvenient. But he also watched her, not in the way powerful men sometimes watched women who worked for them, with the calculating assessment of ownership, in the way people watch things that have become necessary without their permission. She caught him once, from across the room, looking at her with an expression that was entirely unguarded, something between wonder and trouble, and when their eyes met he looked away first, which was not a thing she had ever seen Kim Ha-jin do with anything. The danger arrived on a quiet Wednesday. She was leaving his building at midday when a car slowed beside her on the pavement and two men got out. They were not police. Their energy was wrong in a specific way she recognized from certain neighborhoods in Atlanta, men sent by other men to communicate something. Cynthia Williams, the taller one, said, "You clean for Kim Ha-jin." "I clean for a lot of people," she said. She kept walking. The second man stepped ahead of her, blocking the path. "He owes a debt to someone who is interested in using leverage." "I'm a cleaning woman," she said, her heartbeat steady through sheer force of discipline. "I'm not leverage." "That's a matter of perspective," the first man said, and reached for her arm. What happened next was fast. A third figure appeared from the building entrance behind her, moving with a speed that seemed impossible for a man his age, and the tall man found his wrist locked in a grip that had retained 30 years of muscle memory. "Remove your people from my street," Ha-jin said. His voice was very quiet. It was the voice she had never heard him use before, the voice from the life he'd left, and it was absolutely terrifying. The two men looked at him. Something in their calculation shifted. They got back in the car. Ha-jin released the man's wrist. The car left. The street returned to normal. He turned to her. She was looking at him with a complicated expression that was half shaken and half something else entirely. "You were watching from the window," she said. "I was watching from the window," he confirmed. "For how long?" "Long enough," he said. "Come back inside." That evening, over the tea that had become their ritual, he told her about the debt. An old rival who had survived the fall of his organization and was now sending messages through proxies, testing whether Ha-jin had any remaining vulnerabilities worth exploiting. He had assumed they would find nothing. He had not calculated for Cynthia. "You need to stop coming here," he said. "For your own safety." "No," she said. "I'm not asking." "I know," she said. "I'm also not asking." He looked at her with an expression of pure exhaustion that somehow contained something else underneath it, something bright and stubborn and barely held. "You are the most inconvenient person I have ever met," he said. "I've been called worse," she said. A few days later, she arrived to find he had hired two men. They were stationed discreetly in the lobby and outside the building. He introduced them to her as though this were a completely ordinary arrangement, without acknowledging that their primary purpose was to make sure nothing happened to her. She didn't call attention to it. She just nodded. But when she was cleaning the hallway, she stopped for a moment and pressed her forehead against the cool wall and breathed carefully, because things were becoming something she needed to acknowledge to herself, even if she said nothing aloud. She was falling for a 60-year-old dying Korean former crime lord who corrected her pronunciation and had once built an empire on things she was certain she would find morally complicated if she examined them closely. He was arrogant, still. Difficult, always. But he was also the man who had repaired her cleaning caddy without mentioning it, who had stepped off his balcony when she said his name, who had stood on a street and made dangerous men leave without violence because she was there and he had decided that her safety was something he was willing to spend himself on. She admitted to herself in that hallway, completely undone by him. She did not tell him this. The night it came to a head was a rainy Thursday. She had been running numbers for Marcus's next treatment cycle on her phone when Ha-jin came to stand behind her and looked at the screen. She closed it quickly. Sorry, I'll get back to work. How much? He said. Ha-jin, how much does his treatment cost? She turned to look at him. That's not something I'm going to accept from you. I didn't offer yet. You were about to. He looked at her steadily. And if I was? I don't want your money, she said. I want you to stop looking at me like I'm a problem you need to solve. What do you want me to look at you like? The question sat in the air between them. The rain on the windows. The quiet of the apartment. She had no good answer, or rather she had one answer that was too honest for this moment, and she had been carefully not saying it for weeks. You know, she said finally, which was not the same as saying it, but was not entirely different either. He crossed the room. He was not a tall man, but he moved with the particular command of someone who had spent a lifetime occupying more space than his size required. And when he stopped in front of her, he was close enough that she could see the gray at his temples and the lines in his face and the thing in his eyes that she had been deliberately not naming. Cynthia, he said, her name in his voice, accented, deliberate. Don't, she whispered. Not because she didn't want whatever was happening, because she did, and she hadn't given herself permission for it, and some part of her was still waiting for the version of this where it went wrong. Don't what, he said. Tell you what you already know? You're dying, she said. It came out blunt and devastating, the way true things sometimes did. Yes, he said without flinching. And I spent 60 years living as though nothing could touch me, and I was wrong about that in every way possible. And then you walked into my apartment and argued with me about a chair. His jaw tightened. I don't know what to do with what I feel when I look at you. I have not felt this in a very long time. Possibly ever. She looked at him for a long time. You were terrible to me, she said. I was, he agreed. You made comments about where I'm from. About my accent. I know. If you ever do that again, she said, I will walk out and not come back. I know that too, he said. And something in his expression was completely stripped of everything. No performance. No armor. Just the man underneath all of it looking at her, as though she had become the only fixed point in a landscape that had lost everything else. I'm sorry, Cynthia. For all of it. What I said. How I looked at you when you first arrived. I was a man who had decided the world had nothing left to offer, and I was wrong. You were standing right there, and I was wrong. She exhaled slowly. Then she closed the distance between them. What followed was not the collision she might have imagined. It was quieter than that, and more complete. His hands found her face with the careful reverence of someone handling something extraordinary, and she let herself lean into him. And the rain continued against the windows, and the world outside remained entirely indifferent. And inside that small apartment with its thin walls and its view of another building, it didn't matter at all what he had been or what she had expected or how many days remained on the calendar. She woke before dawn, disoriented, and for a moment lay still in the gray light listening to him breathe. Then the fear arrived, the particular fear she had been trying to outrun for weeks. That this was impossible. That she had made herself vulnerable to a man who was temporary by the universe's own decree, and that she had no right to ask him for something permanent, and that he would see this in daylight, and the carefully constructed distance between who she was and who he had been would reassert itself. She got up quietly and gathered her things. She had her hand on the door when she heard him. Don't, he said. She stopped, turned. He was standing in the bedroom doorway. He looked like what he was, a man who had been through a great deal, who had lost almost everything, who had very little time left. He also looked like a man who had decided something. Whatever you're afraid of, he said, stay. Ha-jin, I know what I'm asking, he said. I know every reason it doesn't make sense. I know how little time I can promise you. But Cynthia, he crossed to her. I have spent 60 years in rooms where everyone wanted something from me. You are the first person in my life who wanted nothing from me except for me to keep living. That is not something I intend to walk away from. Not for dignity, Not for pride, not for any story I tell myself about what I deserve. She looked at him for a long moment. You're still going to be difficult, she said. Almost certainly, he said. And you're going to try to pay for Marcus's treatment without telling me. A pause. I wasn't going to hide it for long. Ha-Jin. His doctor is Dr. Song Min-yeol, he said quietly. I know him. We did business many years ago. I spoke to him 3 days ago. The new treatment protocol starts next month. It's already arranged. She stared at him. You did that 3 days ago, she said. I needed to do something useful, he said, with the specific defensiveness of someone who knows they've been caught doing something tender. She walked back to him. She took his face in her hands the way he had taken hers, and she made him look at her, and she said, I'm staying. But we do this together. You don't make decisions about my family without telling me. Agreed, he said. And you see your doctor twice a month, not once. That seems excessive. Twice, she said. He covered her hands with his. Twice, he said. The months that followed were not easy. Nothing about their situation permitted easy. Ha-Jin's health was a variable that didn't resolve in their favor. And there were bad days. Days when the medication made him unreachable and the weight of what was coming pressed down on the apartment like weather. But there were also days when they argued about documentaries, and she cooked badly, and he corrected her, and she told him exactly what he could do with his corrections, and he laughed the real laugh, the one she had first heard on the balcony that night. Marcus's treatment responded better than projected. Dr. Song sent weekly updates. Ha-Jin read every one of them and said nothing. But she once came into the study to find him on the phone with the doctor at 7 in the morning asking precise and technical questions about the protocol adjustments. He looked up when she appeared, completely unabashed. He's responding well, he said. I know, she said. Dr. Song sends me the same reports. I wanted to ask follow-up questions, he said. I see that, she said. The rival who had sent the men came back once more, this time with a more direct threat. A message left with the building manager that suggested Ha-Jin's new situation was being closely observed. Ha-Jin made 2 phone calls. She didn't ask what was discussed. The threat stopped. Whatever remained of his network, whatever quiet alliances had survived the fall of the Black Phoenix, he had spent them on her safety. She understood this without being told. You didn't have to do that, she said when he came back from the second call. Yes, I did, he said simply. One evening in early spring, they were on the rooftop garden, which had become their regular evening arrangement when his health permitted, and the Seoul skyline was doing something extraordinary with the fading light, and Ha-Jin was quiet in a way that was different from his other silences. I need to tell you something, he said. She waited. I spoke to my son, he said. Juno. She turned to look at him. He came back, Ha-Jin said. Not fully, but he came. We spoke for 2 hours. It was difficult. He paused. You said, several months ago, that the only things worth keeping were the ones that still mattered when everything else was gone. You were talking about your brother, but I kept thinking about it. You called him, she said. I called him, he said. It was long overdue. You were responsible for that. I didn't tell you to call him. No, he said. You just made me want to be someone who would. She looked at him in the spring evening light. He was 60 years old and complicated and difficult, and had an extremely high opinion of his own judgment in areas where it was genuinely warranted, and several where it was not. He was also the man who stood between her and danger without being asked, who had memorized the name of her brother's doctor, who had come back from the edge of something irreversible because she had said his name. Ha-Jin, she said. Cynthia, he said. I love you, she said. Direct and clear, the way she did everything. He looked at her for a long moment. I know, he said. I have known for a while. I have been trying to work out whether I had any right to say it back. Do you? No, he said. Probably not. I am 60 years old, and I have done things that don't survive close examination, and I have limited time, and I have never in my life been easy to love. He took her hand. But I do. I love you, Cynthia. I think I have loved you since you argued with me about a chair. The chair was a reasonable thing to argue about, she said. Yes, he said. It was. He turned to face her fully. I spoke to a lawyer last week about restructuring what remains of my assets. Whatever time I have, I want it to be structured around you. And I have a question. She looked at him. He reached into the pocket of his coat and produced a ring, simple, elegant, nothing performative about it. A band with a single dark stone that caught the last of the evening light. I am aware, he said, that I am not an obvious choice. I am aware that marrying a former Korean crime lord who is significantly older and in poor health is not the future you imagined when you were growing up in Atlanta. I am aware that I do not deserve you, and that I have not always treated you well, though I intend to spend whatever time I have correcting that. He paused. I am asking anyway, because I have learned, somewhat late, that the things worth asking for are usually the ones you have no guarantee of receiving. She looked at the ring. She looked at him. If you get worse, she said, you tell me. You don't protect me from it. We go through it together. Yes, he said. And you stop correcting my Korean in front of other people. I correct you because your pronunciation is important. Ha-jin. I will correct you privately. Better, she said. Is that a yes? He said. Yes, she said. That's a yes. He put the ring on her finger with hands that were completely steady. Then he pulled her toward him and held her in the spring evening with soles spread out below them, and she pressed her face into his shoulder and felt the particular quality of his heartbeat, strong despite everything, still here, still choosing to be here. They were married in a small ceremony 6 weeks later. Juno came. Marcus came from Incheon, walking with a cane, but walking. Ha-jin's lawyer attended. Minso, who had become something like a friend in that sideways way that people become friends in complicated circumstances, stood beside Cynthia. Mr. Pyo from the building management wept openly, and no one acknowledged it. Ha-jin wore a dark suit. He looked at Cynthia when she walked toward him with an expression she recognized. The one she had first seen across a kitchen table in a bad apartment in the middle of a gray Seoul afternoon. The one that said something in him had decided she was necessary and was only just beginning to understand what that meant. She smiled at him, and he almost smiled back, which by now she understood was the full extent of his public emotional range, and she had long since decided it was enough. Months later, on a morning with clear cold light coming through windows that always had their curtains open now, she woke to find him already awake, sitting up, his hand resting on the small curve of her stomach that had appeared in the past several weeks with the quiet insistence of something that had decided to exist regardless of anyone's projections. The doctor said probably late autumn, she said. I know, he said. I reviewed the dates. You reviewed the dates, she said. It's an important calculation, he said, with the precise dignity of someone who had decided to have absolutely no embarrassment about his feelings and was handling this by framing them all as logistical matters. She laughed. He looked at her laughing, and the expression on his face was something she would not have been able to describe when she first came to clean his floors with her cleaning caddy and her practical shoes and her quiet, undefeatable sense that she was going to be fine regardless. It was the expression of a man who had built an empire and lost it and survived himself and been pulled back from the edge by the sound of someone saying his name, and who had spent the last year slowly and probably being saved. Ha-jin, she said. Cynthia, he said. We're going to be okay, she said. He looked at her in the clear morning light, in the apartment that had stopped being a holding place for grief and become something else entirely, and she could see him believing it, carefully, the way people believe things that are new and fragile and completely real. Yes, he said. We are. Outside, Seoul was beginning its morning. Somewhere across the city, Marcus was walking a little stronger each week. Somewhere, Juno was on a plane back for his next visit. Somewhere, the future was still uncertain in the way all futures are, full of variables and things that could not be promised. But in that room, in that light, with his hand covering hers, and the whole improbable fact of them settled between them like something ancient and decided, it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. If you believe love conquers all, hit that subscribe button and stay tuned for more interesting stories.